All right, great. So yes, thank you everyone. Welcome to the meeting. It's nice to see all of you. It's been a bit. I saw several of you this weekend, which was great. For today, this meeting today is focused on Module 1 of the zoning rewrite, which we shared with the community February 3rd. We sent out to you as well. So I hope you've all had a chance to look through it a bit, and I know some of you have. We'll be meeting with you on each of the 3 modules. This is Module 1. I'll talk a bit about the modules in a second here. If you want to go to the next slide, Christy. I'll only be speaking very briefly tonight, and I'll share a little overview of the modules, what can you expect from each of them. And then Christy will be leading the show tonight. She'll give an overview of Module 1. If you watched the presentation online, Christy was the star of that, so she's a great presenter. We'll be spending most of this meeting in discussion. We want to hear from you. That's why we're here. We want to get your comments and questions. So we'll spend a bulk of our time on that, and we'll wrap up with some next steps, just confirming for you all what you can expect coming up. I do want to note for any community members who are in attendance, who are not on the steering committee, really glad you're here. Hope we've talked with some of you while we were in town last week, having these meetings last week. While we don't have a community comments built into this meeting, there are a lot of ways you can share your feedback on Module 1 right now, and then the other modules as we move forward. So I'd encourage you to check out the cvilleplans-together.com website for more information about that. So last time we met, we were discussing, you can go to the, yeah, thank you. Last time we met, we were discussing the draft zoning diagnostic and approach document, and that's been finalized now. And that's on the website on the draft zoning page, which is where most of the Module 1 materials live. And since that time, we've been working to draft these 3 zoning modules. So we released in February on the 3rd, Module 1. It's the main topic of our discussion today, as I mentioned. It includes the zoning districts and rules, information about the uses that are allowed, and then the draft zoning map. So that's what Chrissy will be talking through today, and we'll be seeking your feedback on. We expect to share the next module, Module 2, the week of March 13th. That includes development standards, things like landscaping, parking, trees, and we'll also include more specific information about affordability requirements, which we'll talk a bit about today. I know it's of great interest to a lot of folks, including us. And so we expect to have a more robust discussion about that when we get to Module 2. And then I want to know, we expect to share Module 3 the week of April 3rd. That includes the parts of the zoning ordinance that talk about administration, review processes, and whatnot. So perhaps not as exciting for some, but very important, and just as exciting as the other modules for some in the community. As I noted, we had a few open houses last week for Module 1. Again, we'll provide more information as other events are scheduled for the other 2 modules. So what's in Module 1? Again, I know a lot of you have probably taken a look at this already, but just as an overview, there's 3 main parts. The draft zoning map classifies all parcels in the city as a specific zoning district. So Christy will talk through the connection between the comprehensive plan future land use map, which we all spent a lot of time thinking about, the ties between that and the zoning map, because they're closely tied. Another piece of Module 1 is the zoning districts and rules pages, which lay out requirements for the form that development should take in each district. And the use regulations, note which uses are allowed either by right, without special permission, or with a special use permit. So I do hope you've been able to dig into Module 1. There's a longer presentation online that we noted to you a bit, so that has more information than we'll go through today. But I was wondering, could we get a show of hands on the Zoom raise your hand function of who has had a chance to view that presentation or dig into Module 1? Okay. So seeing no shame if you didn't, just trying to get a sense of it. So it looks like quite a few hands, so that's great. I know we've talked to several of you about it as well. So Christy, just a sense for you of, several folks are quite familiar with things. I'll ask that while Christy's talking, if you keep your comments and questions that are longer for the end of the presentation. Like I said, we'll have a really robust discussion. We can go back to pieces of the presentation. If you have clarifying questions while Christy is walking through the presentation, please use that raise your hand function again, and we can pause for clarifying questions. We want to make sure things are clear, but we want to make sure we keep things moving. But with that, Christy, I will pass it off to you.
Okay, thanks, Jenny. And Jenny, if you will keep an eye on the raise hands for me, I've got on a separate screen. So I'm going to try. It looks like most people have listened to the presentation, and this truly just is an abbreviated version of that. So it's going to sound quite redundant to those of you who have seen that presentation. But again, feel free to stop for any clarifying questions you may have.
And I will note, Susan, do you have a question now?
No, was my hand raised?
It is, but that's okay. Thank you.
Wake up.
So I do want to start off and just talk about affordability, because it is one of the primary drivers for this entire process and this project that we're thinking about. As Jenny noted, a lot more of the details of how you would qualify for some of these affordability provisions, how it's measured, how the program is administered, all of that will be coming out with Module 2. We do want to give a brief overview, because if you've looked through the district pages, you'll see things like base and bonus on the page. And we do want to give you a bit of context for what we're thinking about in that regard. So what is affordability? We are saying that when we say something is affordable, it means that a family doesn't spend more than 30% of their income for housing costs. And we are saying that our target point for affordability is 60% of area median income. And one thing we do want to highlight in how we're thinking about affordability, it really comes in two flavors. One is required inclusionary zoning, and the other is an optional density bonus. So when we say required inclusionary zoning, what does that mean? That is for projects that have 10 or more housing units, and that requires that 10% of those units be affordable at 60% of AMI. So that is a requirement for those projects. On the other side, we have, when you see that base bonus, that base is just what you're allowed by right. But if you want, as an option, to provide affordability, then you have a couple options. In those residential districts, and we'll go through a bit more later about what that means. So residential A, B, and C, you can achieve that density bonus if all of those units are affordable. In the other districts that are not those residential A, B, and C, so all other districts, you can get additional height allocated if you provide 10% of those units at 50% affordability. So same amount of units, but at a deeper level of affordability. And that's the option side of the coin, if you want to think about it that way. So how do we use these district pages? We'll dig in a bit more into what exactly the different metrics are, but just to orient you, I want to point out a couple things and how the different pieces of this document really work together. The first is just understanding what the district is and what it's named. And so you'll see in that colorful bar across the top of the page, we have an abbreviation for the district. The example I'm using is residential A. And then we have the full district name next to it. We have used that, that color associated on that bar to help with the legibility of the document. So as we look at things like the use table, and as we look at things like the map, that same color is associated with the district allowances on the use table, as well as where this district is mapped. So it kind of helps color code and orient you to where these districts are applied. The second piece of this is on the district pages, you will see a list of standards that are associated with it. So things that you have to build or requirements that say where and how you can build on a parcel. Some of these are pretty common. It should sound familiar to what you have today, but some of them are new. And I really want to encourage you to, as you look through these district standards, use that part of the document called the rules for zoning districts. So I like to say that these are compatible pieces of the document that I almost like to have side by side, just like we've illustrated on this page. Because we are essentially summarizing everything on the district pages, but those rules for zoning districts give you all of the detail of what it means, when it applies, what the standard is trying to do and how it's measured. And so they truly are compatible documents that as you go down each of those standards, the rules are organized in the exact same way. So you'll see that first title, size for subdivision. It matches identically and will be PDF linked once this document moves from a draft form to a final form. So you could just click on that section and it would take you to that size for subdivision portion of the document. And you could start to understand the definition of it, the intent, when it applies, the standards, and how it's measured. So these really are meant to be compatible, and I would just encourage you to use them that way. So let's talk about what's on the district pages themselves. They all come in this sort of 2-page spread format with 4 columns. That first page on the left-hand side is everything that has to do with the more 2-dimensional setup of your parcel or lot itself. So it looks at things like the size a lot needs to be if you're subdividing, how many units you can put on that parcel. So that's the density piece, how much building coverage you can have. And then in the next column, it talks about things like building setbacks. How close can you be to your side neighbor or the rear parcel? And then we've also built in sort of a newer metric in some districts that is not just a minimum front setback, but a maximum front setback. And that's really part of that trying to move to a more pedestrian oriented environment where we're putting the people space up front and sort of requiring that parking in the back. So that's, if you want to dig into that more, go look at the rules for zoning districts. It tells you how that's measured, when it applies, things like that. So that's the build to requirement. You see it's a bit new of a metric. And then it also talks about where parking can or can't be located on this parcel. The second page is where we start to think about the 3-dimensional elements of the building. And it addresses things like height. I will point out in this example, you see that base and bonus height. So that's that optional affordability that I mentioned earlier. So you have a base allowance of height in both stories and feet. And then if you move to that optional affordability bonus, then you are allowed to build the bonus height. So you can see that sort of working on the district page in this example. After height, we talk about the massing of the building. And so that has to do with the width of the building itself and what we're calling the active depth, which is really the people space inside of the building. We want to make sure that it's not, in an example of a townhouse, for example, sometimes you'll get the first floor that's entirely a garage. We want to make sure that there's a bit of an active lining on the front of that building as it orients to the street. So things like that are addressed in the massing section. Similarly, in ground story, we're thinking about that ground story height and how tall the ceiling is, as well as how that finished floor of the first floor is associated with the surrounding topography, wanting to make that more pedestrian oriented. And then finally, that 4th column has to do with things like transparency, and that has to do with the amount of windows and doors that you're having on the facade of a building as it faces the street, how many entrances you have. This really reinforces that good urban design again. And then also it deals with walls and fences, specifically along the right of way. So any wall or fence that is in a common lot line, sort of with your next door neighbor or in the rear, we're not regulating today, so we wouldn't be regulating in this new proposed ordinance either. Any questions about generally the layouts of these pages so far? We're going to dive into the districts themselves. Good. Okay, I'll keep moving. I do want to touch on allowed uses. So you'll see these color bars are showing up again. So we have all of our permitted uses consolidated into a table. And I do want to point out that there are certain letters associated with that. So if you see a P showing up, that's a permitted use. An S is a special use permit. And that's the same process you have today. And then if you have a star next to either the P or the S, that means that there's some use standards, some additional criteria that are required in that particular district for that particular use. So all that's consolidated in the use table. Following that is a section of use definitions where you're trying to understand where a specific use may fall within these categories. You can go look at the use definitions and then refer back to that use table to understand the allowances. And then following that are those use standards. So those are, again, specific criteria that may be associated with certain uses in certain districts. I do want to touch on how we are thinking about this conversion from the future land use map into zoning districts. We'll dive into that a bit more specifically and how the specific future land use categories have become zoning categories. But I do want to highlight that the future land use map really is the foundation that we're using in order to apply the zoning districts. We have also layered on this idea of using the streets that work plan. There's some street typologies associated with that, and how we're thinking about, as a future land use category becomes zoning districts, how that may influence the categorization of those zoning districts. I'll get into a bit more of what that means later when we get into the districts themselves. So you can see the future land use map is here on your left, and the proposed zoning map is here on your right. We tried to use similar colors, and what you'll notice, again, I just want to emphasize that translation. It is, the zoning map is directly influenced and translated from this future land use map. And we'll go through each of those categories to dive into how exactly we made that translation. I would encourage you also to look at the mapping methodology document that we have on the Cville Plans Together website. And it talks about this in even finer grain and even greater detail if you're interested in those technical aspects of it. So that information is available on the website. So I'm going to talk a bit about the future land use categories and how those become our zoning categories. So there are districts within these categories, but I think it's useful to think about the zoning categories as more of an umbrella. So you will see that the general residential and medium intensity future land use categories, those became our residential zoning districts. There are different flavors of those, but it's under the residential umbrella, that category. Everything that was higher intensity from the future land use category became residential mixed use zoning. Anything that was neighborhood mixed use corridor or urban mixed use corridor, those became our corridor mixed use districts. You'll notice some naming conventions that are starting to really tie together, and that's intentional because we did want to explicitly tie together the land use and the zoning districts. Same thing with neighborhood mixed use node, urban mixed use node, those became our node mixed use zoning districts. Same thing with your downtown core. That is your downtown node. So it is also a node zoning district. The business and technology mixed use became industrial flex districts. And you had some other categories, things like cemeteries, parks, campuses. Those became special districts as well as overlay districts. I do want to go through these one by one so you can start to understand our intent for these categories, where the districts are that are implementing these different land use categories, to give you an idea of the flavor and how we're mapping them. I will say that in this more abbreviated presentation, we are only going to look at the explicit mapping of the residential categories and how those were implemented, because it is the most of what we got questions about. In the longer version of this presentation, we went through how each of the land use categories became mapped with zoning districts. So feel free to dive into that if you're interested in anything beyond the residential zoning categories. As far as residential, the intent of this is to provide a range of low to moderate intensity housing options. So that can be anything from a single unit house, a duplex, a triplex, up to a townhouse or a small apartment. And in general, these are supported and within walking distance of neighborhood serving retail, food, service uses. So it is getting at that more walkable intent for the future of your community. The districts that have implemented this are residential A, residential B, and residential C. You'll notice that these are the only districts that have letters at the end. The remaining of our districts have numbers. So they're, something, something 2, something, something 4. When it's a letter, it goes from least intense to most intense in general. And A, B, and C is really just a designation of that level of intensity. When it gets to a number, that is associated with a number of stories you're allowed to build. And so it's meant to be just a shorthand to help you understand what is and I should say that is the base allowance. Most of these do have bonuses associated with them, but it's meant to help you just immediately understand, okay, if I'm a corridor mixed use 5, that's a 5-story district. So I did want to orient you to that as well. So let's talk about where these got implemented. For the general residential land use category, those all became residential A. So this is truly a one-to-one conversion. If you're a future land use map category of general residential, everything in that category became residential A. I think medium intensity does a good job of illustrating how we wove in this idea of the street typologies from the streets that work plan. So when we were thinking about the medium intensity land use categories, we knew we had these two implementing zoning districts, residential B and residential C. And they're a bit different as far as the number of units you're allowed to build and the height allowed within those districts. And so we used the streets that work typologies and looked at the intersections and nodes of those mixed use and neighborhood streets. And those were the areas that we designated residential C. So it's a bit more intensity than what's allowed in residential B, still falls within the framework that was laid out within the comprehensive plan and the future land use categories, but it helps think of that idea of aligning infrastructure with the logic of applying these zoning districts. So you can think about that as even you look into the corridor and node mixed use categories, we relied on the streets typology from the streets that work plan to help us guide those nodes and those intersections and when to apply which district. Any questions so far? I'll keep moving. Our residential mixed use zoning category, again, this is our higher intensity land use. These are meant for moderate to higher intensity housing options. So it could be as small as something like a duplex, triplex, but spans all the way up to the larger apartment complexes that would have something like structured parking. And there are two flavors of these zoning districts. So we have residential mixed use 3, that's our 3-story district base allowance, and mixed use 5, 5-story. And you can see the sort of difference in scale that could be allowed under this district as it moves from a 3-story district, which is likely to be surface parked, to a 5-story district, which moves you more into that that decked or structured parking scale of development. Our corridor mixed use zoning districts, these are meant to be a mix of office, residential, and they can really accommodate a variety of uses. So they can be fully residential buildings, they can have a mix of retail, some service, commercial, primarily along corridors that are more pedestrian oriented or are hoping to become that way in the future. And you can see that we have a 3-story district, a 5-story district, and an 8-story district associated with this. And I'll remind everyone, these are our neighborhood mixed use and urban mixed use corridor land use categories. And so they became corridor mixed use zoning districts. Our node mixed use really moves up a bit in scale, but really we're more thinking about the form of the building as it meets that right of way or that sidewalk. So the uses aren't that different from the previous category. You know, we're thinking of these as mixed use, office, they could be residential buildings, and they can accommodate all kinds of different uses, residential, retail, commercial, and we're not requiring these to be mixed use, but it's strongly encouraged. One of the ways that we encourage that in our node zoning districts is looking at that those standards for transparency and ground story height. So we generally will require those to be what we call retail ready. And so that means that there's a taller ceiling height associated with that ground floor and a higher transparency requirement. We're not saying that commercial has to go in there today because the market just simply may not support it, but it's built in a way that it could be commercial in the future. So that's one of the key differences between a node zoning district and a corridor zoning district. We do have a lot more flavors of this zoning. So we have districts that are 3-story, 5-story, 8-story, 10-story, and then we have a special district for downtown. The reason we do that is because there are areas that are going to require additional standards for things like the pedestrian mall, and that may require something like a height step back in upper stories because we're thinking about how that is a unique urban form to the rest of the city. So downtown tends to get its own district in most places. So we're thinking of that as being its own district itself. The next is the industrial flex zoning. This is really intended to accommodate a lot of those employment centers and can range from things like maker spaces, breweries, coffee shops, artist studios, but it's meant to be in places that are vibrant and pedestrian oriented. There can be a mix of residential within these. And so it's those light industrial and those light manufacturing uses that don't have any spillover effects or any noxious chemicals or any storage, things like that, that can be in a more pedestrian oriented environment. I think X Park is a really great example of something that you have today that's sort of functioning in that way. So it's, warehouse rehab, thinking about those maybe more attainable to rent commercial spaces as startups come along. So that's where we're thinking about something like an industrial flex would be for the purposes of those maker spaces that work in a more pedestrian oriented environment. And so we have a 5-story district and an 8-story district version of that. I do want to touch on a couple of special zoning categories we have. Those come in the flavor of campus and civic. And these really are zones for things that don't particularly well assimilate into other categories. They're things like for campus, medical districts, private schools, campus buildings that the university may own that sort of exist in a more campus format. And then civic buildings are things like parks and schools, fire stations that are publicly owned. So we want to create a special category for that. And it helps with some of the idea of preserving parks for open space and things like that when you can give it a civic zoning category. So that's part of the intent of that. I do want to touch on alternative forms. This is something that would be associated with those use standards I spoke about earlier. And so these could be forms that would be available to parcels or particular areas that may meet certain standards. And so the reason that we're thinking about creating something like this, particularly like a corner store or a shop front house, is that you have a lot of these existing in your communities today, but they're non-conforming. And so by building in some use standards, this is an alternative form that something like a residential A, B, or C district may be able to use if they meet certain standards. And when I say that, I mean things like it could have to be located on a corner lot, or maybe the parcel has to be a certain size, or there are greater restrictions on what that commercial use can be. So it has to be a smaller footprint that wouldn't have any spillover effects to its neighbors, things like that. But we do want to build in some of these alternative forms to re-legalize a lot of those great neighborhood serving uses that you have embedded in your communities today. I do want to touch on overlay districts. So for the most part, we are keeping most of your existing overlay districts. These are things like individually protected properties, your architectural design control districts, historic conservation, your flood hazard protection areas. So everything that is, historically protected or environmentally protected, that will be carried forward in this ordinance. We are continuing conversations with the sensitive community areas that were identified in the comprehensive plan. So there will be more detail coming out in module 2 for that. And that is an ongoing conversation that we're having with those communities, because we want to make sure that we respond in the zoning in the way that those communities are wanting to see the zoning respond. So all that to say, you will not see anything different in sensitive communities in this module, but that is forthcoming. We are still having those conversations. That is it for my quick overview. Jenny, are you okay if I hand it back over to you now?
Sure. Yeah. So just want to give a reminder, this is where you can find all of these materials, which I think most of you have seen, but just a reminder, here's the URL. It's also linked from the front page of the website, so you can find it all there. So I think we don't need to go through it all the way, but we can, if we need to, as we're talking, we can pull up any resources and go from there. But at this point, I guess, Christy, do you want to stop sharing your screen? We'll pull up the next steps at the end, just as a reminder when we close out.
Yeah, sounds great.
And I'll ask, there's 2 written questions in the chat, which yes, you all should feel free to use the chat as we go. So Christy, let's start with those. And then if others have questions from the steering committee, again, just the steering committee, please, use the raise your hand, or you can continue to put them in the chat, and we'll just sort of go in the order that hands are raised. We want to make sure we hear from as many people as possible. We've got quite a bit of time to do that, so I think we should have a good discussion. But let's see, Peter Krebs had the first question in the chat, which is, how exactly do you define how the alternative forms integrate with the districts?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's actually something that we wanted to have a conversation about and get your feedback here today. That is something that we are hoping to put a draft out for in module 2. And some examples are things that I mentioned. So some communities want to allow alternative forms. Well, I should say, you can specify which districts can have access to those alternative forms. So currently we're thinking that districts RA, RB, and RC would make sense to allow these alternative forms in. because those are generally the neighborhoods and the communities where they currently exist. So having said that, some of the standards can include things like only allowing them on corner parcels, only allowing them if you have additional screening, sort of buffers to the residential neighbors with a bit more upgraded landscaping. Sometimes and often the limits, right now we're saying something like commercial uses up to 4,000 square feet. Maybe that's too much. Maybe these need to be more like commercial uses up to 1,000 square feet. And so we can apply a standard like that would, allow for a smaller footprint shop front house or store. There are also certain uses that could be allowed. So it could be limited to professional service, office, things like that. Or it could be limited to something like small footprint retail, coffee shops. So those are all options. And we would really love to get you all's feedback on what you think may or may not be appropriate.
And as you said that, I was reminded that we did include a few questions to get you thinking on the agenda. If you didn't see those, I can put them in the chat too, but that was one of those 3 questions, was sort of, with these alternative forms, are there certain rules that you think we should put in place for when they're allowed, such as a corner store? So I guess before we move on to the next question, any thoughts on that topic?
Yeah, I mean, I'll bite on that since I raised the question. I mean, so, anyone that follows my work knows that I love these alternative uses, and they're what makes cities great. I don't really envy the task of integrating them, because you have this neat, tidy monopoly map looking spreads for the, districts. And we don't want to make it complicated, but we also don't want to have the simplicity like mandate be something that says, nope, you can only do stuff that's like a rectangle and square and looks like our diagram. So do it in a way that is easy and like noticeable, so it's not sort of buried for someone who's doing a project and like knows right away, like maybe even at a glance, what the potential of their lot is.
It's great feedback. Thank you.
Other thoughts on this alternative forms conversation piece? All right. Well, then we'll go to the next question that's in the chat. So Lyle asked, and I have not heard this term before, but how are we thinking of houses of worship and the Yes in God's Backyard movement of providing affordable infill on site? So the Yes in God's Backyard was what I had not heard of. But, so Christy, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think inherently, church sites are actually really great candidates for a lot of the infill types of housing that we're trying to enable in this zoning, because they generally tend to be on larger parcels. And those, honestly, parcel size tends to be one of the most limiting factors of the arrangement and just the functional ability to build the housing units and to be able to get access to the rear of the parcel. So if there's a particular parcel that you're thinking about maybe challenging, or we'd love to hear that. But I do think inherently the districts that we're proposing would help enable a lot of that.
Okay. Great. Let's see. We had one more in the chat, and then Diane has her hand up. So Diane, I just want to make sure. Do you have a comment on that? Otherwise, we'll wait until after the chat question.
No, I don't have a comment.
Okay, thanks. We'll be right back. So question from Tim was, can we discuss how zoning lot requirements and building requirements only focus on the built environment and do not incorporate considerations of the natural environment?
Yeah, it's a great question. And there will be a lot more information about the natural environment in module 2. So that's where we talk about tree protection. We talk about landscape requirements. And of course, we know that's a priority. It just happens to fall in the second module. I will say that the way that Charlottesville's ordinance is written, unfortunately, stormwater lives in a different chapter. So it's not really being considered as a part of this effort, although it should be. Once this code hopefully moves forward and goes to adoption, then things like subdivision, things like stormwater should absolutely be evaluated to make sure that they are incorporating these goals of environmental protection.
Yeah, thanks. And that's helpful because I think the tree commission is, looking forward to seeing module 2 and looking at the development standards. I think we were just a little bit concerned that some of the form-based code, like it's really clear and well organized and sophisticated. It's kind of exciting really to help solve how do we do by right infill in a way that matches our existing urban fabric and kind of uses best practices. I think we're just concerned that, based on some of the setback or other form-based regulations, that it's not intentionally kind of preemptively, proactively incorporating the necessity of having trees and other landscaping threaded into our urban fabric, especially because while we're a city experiencing affordable housing crisis, we're also experiencing like an urban forest or a community forest crisis, and it's just declining year after year after year. So I think we wanted to just raise that issue as early as possible. I think it's much more complex than just setbacks, but I do think one specific example, maybe in the zoning lot requirements, is consideration of a maximum build to width. I think there's been some healthy debate among tree commissioners. Where would a front setback of 0 feet be appropriate? And I'm of the mindset that can be great, as long as we don't have a whole district where every lot has 0 setbacks and no ability for, streetscape plantings, not just in the right of way per se, but also in the front yard setback area itself. So it seemed like one way to maybe get at that was pairing the minimum build to widths with the introduction of a maximum build to width. And I don't know any more than that as far as like what's the best practice. Is it 80%? Is it, variable with incentives built in somehow? We would leave that up to the experts to speak to, but I think we wanted to raise that and really emphasize that it seems like a crisis as well.
Yeah, I think that's great feedback. One thing I would encourage you to do and would love feedback on, and maybe you already have taken a look at it, is in that build to requirement, we try to build in some flexibility so that open space, if it's amenitized, so it meets certain design standards, landscaping can be one of those, then it counts toward that build to requirement. So if you have like a really great heritage tree, for example, if you add some benches around it and make it pedestrian and accessible, then it can count towards that build to requirement. If there are additional things that we can be thinking about, we would love feedback on that, because it is part of that balance. And we do want to incentivize, things like front yard trees, and don't want to have the build to requirement preclude that from happening. So it's a great example of how we can build in flexibility to meet these goals in a compatible way.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. And I did catch the 2 comments from the chat, so I'm recording. Oh, actually, one of them only came to me, but just some other comments about the tree conversation. So we'll record those in the notes. But for now, we will go to Diane, who's been waiting patiently. Go ahead, Diane.
Thanks. I must admit that your presentation triggered some thoughts that I didn't necessarily focus on as I was looking through the material. So if this is explicitly explained somewhere, great. But when you're talking about the different, the heights, 3, 5, the different levels of heights allowed per district, are there any instances in the plan where you have adjacencies, where you're going from a 2.5 residential A or B into these higher density areas, where you're going worst case scenario from 2.5 to 8 or whatever? Are there any areas of the plan where that happens? And if so, are there zoning requirements for handling those adjacencies?
Yeah, it's a great question. And you will get a lot more information about transitions in module 2. So that is explicitly one of the things that we address. There's an entire section called transitions that you should look at when module 2 comes out. And it talks about how far a building needs to be stepped back from a sort of setback perspective, as well as the building goes up, additional height step back requirements. So, you know, after 3 stories, that next story has to be stepped back from that building a certain amount. So that is something that will be included, those transitions in module 2. That will also include some landscape or buffer requirements for things like an opaque fence or a bit of landscaping. There are different scales of that because, you know, we know that a 3-story building next to a 5-story building may not require quite as large of a buffer as something that is a 3-story building next to an 8 or a 10-story building. So we are trying to make those contextual so that, you know, some of the smaller parcels in Charlottesville are still developable, but it is giving that relief whenever there is that that adjacency that could cause some conflict.
Yeah, there's a, I don't live in that neighborhood, but on JPA, when you drive up, there is a infill apartment complex. I don't know if it's 4 stories, 5 stories, adjacent to a little Cape Codder. And the adjacency is, I'm sure it's heartbreaking for a few people. And so as that, there's the immediate adjacency, the transition, maybe a neighborhood will change over time, but those early arrivals, early adapters, and what you know, what will happen in that neighborhood, and you know, just the I'm glad to see that it'll be detailed. I wonder, and I guess the administration is to follow, but even what is the enforceability of those requirements? How will that, in a nutshell? I mean, I get it that it's coming in module 3, but how does that get reviewed and ensured to happen?
So when a plan comes in for review to be constructed, that is one of the boxes that will have to be checked by the planning staff. So they will check to make sure that that transition and those requirements are adhered to.
Okay. Okay, and I understand that module 2 is where all the parking and landscape and other details exist. But I hope you're not, clearly you're not operating in a vacuum between module 1 and module 2, that they're informing each other. And like the question that just came up with regard to landscape, it's very hard to look at module 1 and the imprint on the 2-dimensional imprint on each of these lots as an example without some information about the landscape. So I'm wondering if you can at least discuss how it's been informing, you know, you use the phrase missing middle. Well, how about the missing landscape? You know, how it's informing that template, you know, what you have in your mind's eye about what is coming in module 2 that we don't have. And so therefore it's, you know, there's a real gap in our ability to appreciate and discuss it. How are, you know, what are some of the big gestures or requirements? And I asked this in the same thing for parking, that in, I think, the meeting before or in the fall, whenever it was, it doesn't matter. In the development of the affordability plan, there was a lot of discussion about incentives for off-site parking that aren't reflected in, I'm realizing my question has many prongs and maybe I should stop and let you answer, but you know, there's incentives for reduced parking that isn't being reflected up front in these standards. You know, how does that work? And then we also talked about, or at least there was a suggestion, I know I made it, looking at incentives for creative incentives in landscape or in urban ecology or stormwater area that would affect that template. Will there be a dialogue between module 1 and 2 on such incentives, and how might that, if you could give a preview? So I don't know if you want to break that into several answers, I mean, to my questions.
I think I get the gist of what you are asking, but if I'm missing the mark, please feel free to follow up. we are currently drafting module 2, and so we are taking a lot of the comments from this conversation right here and the conversation that we had in the open houses, and we've heard a lot about trees, wanting to make sure that landscape, like I mentioned earlier, stormwater is unfortunately not in our purview right now, but we're still trying to think about how we can, within our sort of bubble of zoning, still help incentivize those things to the extent that we can. So one of several of the things that we're thinking about is your existing tree protection and canopy maintenance policy. So, one of the questions that we're wanting to ask to groups like you all is, what's not working about that today? How can we change that in order to get at some of the goals that you have as a community for environmental protection? So we would love feedback on things like that. We are trying to think about and talk about trade-offs. Parking is a huge one. When you require parking, that means that you're covering up a lot of land that can be used for stormwater infiltration, and unfortunately it generally means taking down a lot of trees. And so that's one of the big things that we're trying to provide flexibility for, is where it makes sense, not requiring that parking in a way that is antithesis to these goals of canopy protection. I don't know if that gets at what you're asking.
You're addressing it, but you're not giving me any answer. I think that I've been speaking at every meeting on environmental issues. So for the record, there's a long, I've been the environmental harpy for the last 3 years. So, I look at this density, and in terms of environmental issues, a question that comes up is, what's the waste management strategy for this level of intensity? How are we, what are we doing? All the different levels. If you think of the city as a complex array of systems thinking, right? And you're looking at all the different, energy, water, waste, air, et cetera, how they're all coming in and how they will be affected by the increased intensity. I mean, the intelligent, comprehensive, and once upon a time, this was a comprehensive plan update exercise that, with all due respect, has lost its comprehensiveness, because of the focus on housing, where all these other systems are clearly going to be affected by it. So I think that there's representatives of the city in this meeting. If someone might talk about it, how will the city in a meaningful time, look at these systems so that this zoning change is not off and running and it's too late. I mean, there's a climate adaptation action plan rather, but it's very high level, only advisory, aspirational. It's not going to inform or direct anything that's going to happen in the early years of this work. So how I guess I just continue to see real gaps that are disappointing to see and of concern, and I think don't help to assure the general public on what might happen over the next 5 or 10 years. And to that point, I'm wondering, and I think the answer is going to be no, but I'll bring it up again anyway, is that as there's these changes that will be allowed and infill, I wonder if there isn't a creative mechanism to be looking at carrying capacities of any one area of town. We're assured that the marketing and economics are saying that this is going to happen slowly, not in a worst case scenario kind of thing, which is of course what most people are fearing. But as you look at in any area where if there is fast redevelopment. And some blocks or neighborhoods, whatever, end up carrying more load of cars, stormwater, decimation of the remains of their tree cover, et cetera. Is there any way to look at carrying capacities and limit, and again, I think the answer is, even if as I'm thinking out loud about this, I'm already answering no to myself, but you know, just the concern for a reasonable block or area neighborhood carrying capacities for change, you know, that'll happen. That's a question.
Oh, I think as far as the purview of zoning, you know, that becomes challenging. It's really more of a question of funding from the city. So I encourage you to continue to raise the question of infrastructure. You know, something that every city, as change occurs, that they should be thinking about. So while zoning is not the particular tool for that, it doesn't mean it's important. So comment well taken. We'll certainly incorporate that as we can into zoning, but it's less of a tool than the funding portion of the city. That really is the tool for that. And as far as your comments on environmental protection, I really want to encourage you, when module 2 comes out, know that is our first draft, and we want all of your comments, all of your thoughts on how we can build in incentivizing this environmental protection piece. That really is the bulk of where a lot of that lives. So that is going to be the time for those conversations of understanding how these district rules and how those site rules really play together. So I think we can have a really robust conversation about that at the steering committee meeting once we have module 2. So I'm looking forward to that.
Are there still, just to clarify, are there still incentives for parking, et cetera? Will module 2 address incentives?
Yes.
Okay.
All right. Well, thank you, Diane. I think those are good questions. I'm sorry we don't have explicit answers for some of them, but I think some of them will be answered as we move forward. But I do want to go to our next hand, which is Ashley Davies.
Hi, everyone. I wanted to build on Tim's comments, and when I was reading through the code, I did get a little bit concerned, and I was just wondering if we could have probably just like a little more flexibility in that build to line, like that not all sites. So I think that people that develop land in Charlottesville will be likely to want to, you know, maximize the use of their property, but I don't know if we have to be so explicit in having just really tiny areas. And I just bring it up because we already have so many issues with working, you know, you brought up streets that work, and I'm glad that you're looking at the code and utilizing that plan as well. But I really encourage your team to also be connecting with public utilities, because we already have such a challenge as we're developing sites in Charlottesville. We get really suburban standards on utilities and easements, and I think it would be helpful to have some suggestions maybe from more urban environments and as to how you can accomplish all the various utilities, as well as the lush landscaping that we want to achieve and the density of housing. So, you know, similar to Diane's comments, like we need all those systems in place. And I just worry if we're forcing such a tiny setback on all these sites that we really won't be able to accomplish them. And I don't like that the only way you can do it is in those public spaces, like I think we just need a little bit more flexibility, a little bit more breathing room. And I guess I also wonder in previous versions of the code, specifically as it relates to landscaping, but I think this could also relate to other sections of the code, just the ability to have some staff level waiver process if they're, because we're going to get into a lot of site specific issues, and there may be better outcomes that we can achieve if there is some type of stopgap waiver process. So those are my basic concerns.
Yeah, thanks for those comments. And exactly the kind of feedback that we're trying to get from this process. The build to requirement is something that we have to right size for every community. So it may be that, right now in residential A, for example, we have a flexibility built in where you essentially can be as close as your closest neighbor and as far back as your furthest neighbor. And so it's sort of a contextual requirement. And maybe that makes sense as you go into RB or RC as well. So it still is a sort of build to per se, but it gives you a bit more flexibility. So those are the types of things that we're trying to make sure that we right size to balance all of these different things. And I will just reiterate again, if there are incentives or sort of pre-codified flexible options of meeting the build to requirement besides the building being in there, like that landscape space, then we want to respond to those concerns and build in some of that flexibility. We are thinking about administrative flexibility. That's a bit more of a legal question that we're trying to navigate with state law, but we do know it's important. So we're working through that.
Right. Thanks, Ashley. Next up, we have Jonathan Rice.
Thanks. Let's see, looking over the zoning map, a concern that jumped out at me and some of my neighbors was that the CX5 and CX3 categories don't really reflect the topography of our neighborhood. And this is troublesome because we don't really so much object to tall buildings on. I live in the Little High neighborhood. We're bounded by East Market Street between 9th and Mead Avenue. That's generally on the downslope. It's no heartbreak if a pest control service is replaced by some sort of housing. Likewise, East High Street. But then you have the same classifications on 10th Street, which border the RA part of the neighborhood, and with the affordability bonus, you could have 100-foot tall buildings looming over what are at most 20-foot tall houses, residences, and this is at the highest part of the neighborhood in one of the and this. I'm a big fan of following the contours of the geography and having gradual transitions. I mean, I think it's from what I've observed, the abrupt transition thing is the thing that gets most people really agitated, and there's a reason for that. So I wanted to mention that real quickly, and if I could just ask another quick question about affordability. The 10% inclusionary zoning standard, what do you do with housing, proposed housing units that don't fall into easily divisible numbers, easily divisible by 10? So like if a developer does 15 units, do you round up to 2, or do you stay at 1 affordable unit? What about at 19? Is there do you have a breakpoint in mind, or is this a module 2 question?
It's a bit of a module 2 question, but I can tell you how we generally approach it or are thinking of approaching it. I'm going to try to answer your first question first before I forget that. Transition's absolutely important. And if those properties are immediately adjacent to lower intensity districts, please do look. We will have a table that shows if you're this district and adjacent to this district, here's your required transition. Take a good look at those and make sure we're right sizing them, because we do know it's an important question and it may be different in different parts of the community. So we do want to make sure that we're spot checking these metrics and that they are making sense and that they're addressing a lot of those looming concerns. So although that is in module 2, I just do want to flag it as something for it, because it does seem to be a particular issue in your neighborhood. Another thing is we are thinking really hard about how to measure height, because you do have topography, and how we want to measure height is requiring the building to step down with topography. So that has to do with how we are identifying a ground story. And the reason we're measuring in both number of stories and feet has to do with larger buildings. We want those to step down with the topography, so you don't end up with issues, with a property that may fall down in the back and back up against the lower density district. You end up with sort of a towering building if you're not measuring height in a way that follows that topography. So we are thinking about that. And, I think that's a great example of something that, as the code comes out, spot checking those with real projects that exist on the ground to make sure that, would the way that we are proposing measuring height, would that address some of those concerns? Would these transitions help address some of those concerns? So most of that information will be coming out module 2. Please take a look at it. And as far as affordability in general, whenever anything is measured and it requires a whole number of something, we say round up to the nearest whole number. There will be an inclusionary zoning manual associated with, so it's going to be outside of zoning. It's the administrative manual. It tells you things exactly like that. When there's a fractional unit, what do? Do you measure up and when? It also tells you how to calculate 60% AMI, what's included in that, when do you measure it, who's telling you that number. So all of those administrative pieces will be coming out with the administrative manual, and that will come out with module 2.
Excellent.
Okay, thanks, John. Susan, you are up next.
Hi, thank you. My name is Susan Payne, and I'm here to represent the downtown area. Friends of Downtown now has 110 members, which is quite a few for our little downtown. And I didn't think we would ever have a question for this wonderful group because of all the expertise gathered here. But at the meeting last week, they asked me to bring up a concern that the city cut down over a dozen of the main signature trees on the downtown mall, which was the canopy. It was a wonderful canopy. It's gone. So we asked, well, what happens? And I guess I didn't know this, but the city has a full-time arborist. And I didn't know that. So we asked the arborist, what happens now? And they basically said it would take over a year of deciding what the tree should be and bidding it and putting the tree in the ground. So think of that, over a year, probably a year and a half. We have experts in Charlottesville. Yeah, I don't know why it would take so long, and no one does. And then the other thing that happened on the heels of that is they went in and they said because of legalities and whatever, they had to take away all the water features. So where the water was is now covered with pieces of plastic, bright orange plastic that kind of looks like some disaster area. We asked, what can we do? What's allowed? And the answer is, we don't know what's allowed. But we're going to stop. We're going to cover up what you had before and close down all the fountains, like in Central Place and others, and just, put wire up and fencing. And I don't know if there's anyone in zoning or anyone in this group that has more knowledge because it really looks terrible. or any ideas, or would they, when you're talking about tree canopies, do you say what the tree canopy should be? And can you do it faster than a year and a half, was the question.
Well,
So I may have to
That's all.
rely, yeah.
We appreciate your work and thank you for listening.
yeah, thanks, Susan. We might have to ask the city folks to follow up with you on that because that's a little bit outside. Most of that's sort of outside the purview of zoning specifically, but with certainly discussing a lot about trees tonight. So I understand your thinking, but I guess, Christy, was there anything specific to the zoning that you want to respond to on that?
No, I was just going to say the same, that seems like a current city issue that I'm not going to be the best person to answer. So I encourage you to reach out
Well, I guess
to
there's,
city folks on that.
Peter maybe can figure out an answer.
Yeah, I would say the one thing that we are thinking about is, we in module 2 will include landscape standards. And so that says things like how often you have to plant canopy trees and what we mean by a canopy tree. What are the qualities that are associated with that?
Question. Help me out, guys. Isn't that the question I'm asking? What is the canopy tree? I think that's what we're asking.
And so what we're currently using, and would of course love feedback on from you all, and as you see module 2 when it comes out, Charlottesville currently has a list of trees that are qualified in specific species that are canopy, ornamental, street trees, and there's some designations of trees that are better for more wet soils versus ones that are good for street trees or parking lots because they're a bit more resilient, qualities like that. So we are referencing those documents. They're on the city's website somewhere. I'm sorry, I can't tell you exactly where they are right now, but in our landscape standards, we are trying to align with those existing documents. But those documents are something that could be modified in the future. So if there's some issues that are happening, I think that's also good feedback that we can take into consideration and pass on to the city to say that as we're referencing as we create our landscape standards, these associated manuals and documents may also need some updating. So we welcome feedback on that.
And I will note, Susan, some of our helpful steering committee members put notes in the chat about contacts you might want to reach out to, including emails and phone numbers. So
That'd be
good resource for you.
Well, it's just pretty sad to look at that. When people come here, the bricks, which they used as a paving material, are breaking and coming up. And then the trees are getting chopped down.
Right.
Right. Sad
Understood.
situation.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Let's see. We have Ethan, Emily, and then Jean.
Great. Thanks. And I appreciate Kim and Sunshine and others, your comments about trees. And I guess this is maybe more of a module 2 thought or question, but I am kind of curious to hear to what degree the Thomas Jefferson Soil and Water Conservation folks are influencing any of this. They have a huge amount of, I think, state-funded programs to plant natives and deal with stormwater and all kinds of other programs that are, I believe, really well funded and really applicable, particularly to parts of the city that are close to the waterways. So finding a way to dovetail that into that landscape piece, I think, is great. I guess I love trees. My concern is how that can be kind of a tool that is weaponized to prevent housing and other things. And so, if my concern is that people rally around a specific tree that will, if it's not taken down, will prevent, 5 families from living where they want to live. They will have to live further out, and there's an environmental impact to that as well. And for me, it's pretty clear arithmetic is it's worth sacrificing that tree and planting others close by or elsewhere in the city to offset it. But that's I've seen it weaponized a lot. My question is not about that actually, but is a reference to, I think, something Peter Krebs asked in the chat about assessments. And I suspect it's way beyond the purview of this work, but I'm curious if there's like a rule of thumb for what we can expect, how many more units we can expect kind of on an annual basis, what that means for assessments and what that means for city tax revenue and the city's ability to fund all of the other things that people kind of get scared about, water treatment and school desks and all of those kinds of other things. It feels like a lot of this is like, well, we can never afford to have all of these new people living in the city. And if we're not increasing the revenue, sure, but we're increasing the revenue, but I never hear that like anticipated growth on the revenue side of things included in this. Is there any kind of comparable estimate there?
I think the best place to start would be the rate of change analysis that HRNA did and is posted, I believe, with the diagnostic. Jenny, is that correct? Yeah, I'm getting a thumbs up from Lyle.
Sorry, I was trying to get
so-
yeah, we can link you to it. If anyone have trouble finding it, just let me know.
And so I think that would be a good basis or a place to start. As far as how that explicitly ties in with tax revenue, the rate of change analysis really showed that the rate of change is expected to be quite slow. So assessments are rising with property values today, and will likely not be significantly different in the increase tomorrow, even with the new zoning ordinance, because even with a new entitlement, the rate of change is just going to be slow, and assessments change with development. So that's as close to a rule of thumb as I really can get you. But I think it's a worthwhile question to continue to have, particularly with the tax assessor as this proceeds.
Okay. Thanks, Christy. Emily, you're up.
Thanks. I have a question about height, and I wanted to share something that the Thomas Jefferson Planning District Commission brought up when they did a report to City Council. I think it was last month. One of the speakers mentioned that over half of the people living in the city are now spending over half of their income on housing. So I think that is a really important talking point, because the situation just keeps getting worse and worse. And I hear every day about people losing their homes due to back taxes and people being forced to move out to the valley, to Waynesboro, or down to Buckingham, or out to Louisa. So we're just seeing so much pressure on households that are losing stability. So my question about height is that increasing height can be one of the most effective ways to create housing opportunities, but I believe that Module 1 reduced building height from what was in the FLUM, and I was wondering why that happened, and if you could discuss the pros and cons of height, including the limitation that going down to 3.5 stories or 2.5 stories would put on, I think it was 2.5 that they discussed last night at the work session, that limitation on 2x2 or 2/2 homes, which, if I understand it correctly, means 2 townhouses on top of 2 other townhouses, which is a very affordable homeownership option. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a great question. And height is one of the tools that, we're trying to think about and we are trying to address in that affordability bonus for that very reason that you talked about. I will say in the residential category, so residential A, B, and C, we are also trying to balance the economic reality that even with allowing for 3 or 4 units on site, more often than not, the most economically advantageous thing for someone to build is to tear down a house and replace it with one bigger, much more expensive house. And so that's part of the height consideration. And it's also why we're looking at things like building coverage, because we are trying to balance out that misaligned economic incentive with the goals of this plan, right? So the 2.5 story really does, it helps address, some of the larger single unit homes that are coming in. So we're trying to disincentivize that to an extent. You know, we don't want to totally limit what people can do on their property, but we don't want to make that the most economically advantageous option that developers are going to do every time. We are also thinking about building coverage in conjunction with that. So we are increasing the building coverage allowed the more units you put on the property, so that it does help to try to incentivize someone and provide that flexibility. We know it's more expensive to build more units because often you get boosted to a different construction code. You know, you're moving from residential code to a commercial code, and that costs money. So we are trying to think about that box, and we don't want to disincentivize it too much, but we're also trying to get on the other end of it, where that 2.5 story is really one of the few tools we have to make that single unit replacement the most appealing option from an economic perspective. So that's one of the primary reasons that we do it. I don't know if I answered your question fully, but if I didn't, please follow up.
You did. I think the only point of confusion I still have is 2.5 stories would eliminate the 2/2 option, right?
You could still do, I mean, you could tuck a unit under, there's that dormer allowance. So the 1/2 story, you know, you could do a studio style, you know, a creative architect could make a sort of, I'll call it a 1/2 work. But really that becomes a lot more feasible once you get an RB and RC.
Oops, I'm muted. Thanks, guys. Next we have Jean and then Sunshine. I also want to note we have one of our steering committee members, Brandon, is in the attendee list, and I'm trying to promote you to panelist. It's not successful. So if you want to talk at any point, Brandon, raise your hand and I'll unmute you, although you might have just left. Okay. Jean, go ahead.
Okay.
I'm having a hard time hearing you. Yeah, you're good.
I'm representing Preservation Piedmont, and looking at the downtown mall, which is an economic engine. We should be very cautious about significant changes to the zoning ordinance there, which now proposes almost doubling the number of stories by right, and actually doubling it if it is construction is 10% affordable. Also concerning is the proposed elimination of the ability to consider projects individually through a special use permit. All these changes could encourage tear downs on the downtown mall. And we also should consider seeing the downtown mall separately from other parts of the downtown that are proposed downtown mixed use, in order to maintain the height limits and continue to use the special use permits on the just in the downtown mall. Thank you.
Thank you. That is a great point of why we created a special downtown district. So, you know, thinking about that downtown mall in particular is a really unique urban form. And so if, you know, part of what we're doing right now, and we're looking through the design guidelines for that area, I do want to emphasize that those architectural review of the BAR is going to remain in place in those areas. So that would still have to go through a certificate of appropriateness process. And so those design guidelines will still be in effect. But in addition to that, we are thinking about the downtown mall for things like the height step back requirements. You know, it would encourage you or maybe even require you to preserve that historic facade. And then if anything new gets added, it's pushed back significantly. So feedback like that in the downtown in particular, because it is so nuanced, we encourage any sort of feedback you have, particularly, you know, if you have something in your downtown design guidelines that aren't working particularly well right now, feedback on that would also be helpful.
Could I say something else about West Main Street?
Sure.
So currently there are two zoning districts on West Main Street, and it's divided by the Drury Brown Bridge. right now it treats the historic fabric of the east portion with a reduced height limit compared to the west portion, which is quite a bit higher. But, and this is in reaction to the massive apartment buildings that have been built in the middle part of West Main Street and still on the west side. The city has changed the maximum width requirement to 100 feet. And now the proposed zoning would increase that to 275 feet. And that's definitely a concern. And also, unfortunately, the proposed zoning would also dramatically increase the height in the east portion from the current 52 feet to 114, and then I think 144 with affordable components. They've already done a really nice job in the eastern part of West Main Street where they've saved the older buildings and built behind it. That's definitely what we're hoping is the future. Anyway, that's what I wanted to say about that. Thank you.
Yeah, excellent feedback. Please feel free to continue to submit comments like that. That's really helpful as we refine these metrics.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jan. Sunshine, you are up.
Just quickly, I wanted to echo what Emily Dreyfus had raised around the height the height reduction in RA and how it plays out in RB and RC as well. Your point, Christy, around trying to mitigate the pressure of McMansions kind of overtaking and getting built on those sites. That's a valid point. I hadn't thought about that, so thank you for bringing that up. I do wonder, however, if there is a more finer pointed tool we can use that doesn't then also prevent when you are doing a 2/2, which is a multi-unit building, or some equivalent that gets a little more density without constraining it just by the height. So I would just state that I think that there's value in giving that a second look about how we address that, not for single buildings perhaps, but single unit buildings. But for if you're doing a 2/2 or a similar typology, if there's a way to kind of flex on the height, I think that would be helpful.
Yeah, great feedback. Thank you.
Thanks, Sunshine. Michael Payne, you are up.
Yeah, just very quickly to that point, I don't know if it's the one final answer to that, but Phil Duranzio wrote this in the chat as well. But last night at the Planning Commission joint City Council meeting, the consensus was for allowing a higher height if it was 3 units or more in those residential zones. And that's sort of, at least for the moment, what we arrived as a way to try to avoid the incentive for McMansions while still allowing that flexibility for 2/2s or other more dense housing types. So just wanted to highlight that.
Thank you.
That's great context. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Jean, did you have another question?
Oh, yeah, sure. I have lots. I didn't know my hand was still raised, but I have other points to say. One is that we're pleased to see the proposed ordinance maintains our historic overlay districts. And we also ask that the entrance corridor design overlay district is also carried forward. And then there's a serious conflict between the proposed zoning districts in our historic overlay districts, which creates an untenable review process for the BAR and increases likelihood of demolitions. Much of our historic districts are proposed to be dramatically upzoned, and we ask that decision to be revisited. It's important not to increase the current zoning district height allowances in the historic districts, not everywhere. Just there, I'm saying that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. I'll lower your hand just so I don't bug you again.
Okay, I might come back.
All right. Well, it's 7 o'clock. We do still have a bit of time. No one's hands are raised. Oh, Peter, go ahead.
Great, thank you. So very quickly in the introduction, it was said that there's like a handy resource to help people understand the logic of the translation of the FLUM to the zoning. Like, after paying attention a bunch, it makes a lot of sense to me. I personally understand what you guys are how that happened. But I also have to communicate it to other people, and that's not so easy. So if there is something like a flow chart or just a handy document that exists already, I'd appreciate if that would be put in the chat, or if not, exist and created. Thank you.
I just put in the chat. We've included it on the website as a separate document. It was in the zoning overview document previously. So we've pulled it out now. It's on the website separately. Should be available. So let me know if this link doesn't work. Did anyone click on it? Works? Okay, cool. So that, yeah, it says from the land use, how do we get from land use on the future land use map to the zoning district? A lot of them are one-to-one, and then there's a list when there's certain criteria that are used. So
yep. Thank you. That's super cool. Thank you so much.
Sure. Other hands, other questions, comments? Jean, go ahead.
Since no one else is again, we're pleased to see incentives for retaining a house in the various districts. I think in the RA district, there is an incentive to retain the original house, and then you're allowed to build an extra unit, right? I think that's true. I know in the yesterday in the work session, there was a lot of discussion on whether there should be an incentive for RB and RC. And people sort of decided there shouldn't be, but there definitely should be an incentive for keeping the main structure. Because you can in a lot of our neighborhoods, there's quite a bit of land behind the houses. You could still build something quite large behind a original building in some districts, other places not. I mean, I don't mean districts, but on some streets. So hopefully we continue to have incentives for keeping the original structure. And it's important to keep in mind that the demolition of buildings and the construction of new ones contributes to climate change. Older buildings should be valued as climate assets. Retaining them reduces embodied carbon emissions, and our greenest, most affordable buildings are the ones that are already built. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. Jonathan, go ahead.
I don't know if this is module 2 or if it comes up in any module, but I mean, one of the really basic infrastructure things for increasing density has got to be building sidewalks and improving the ability of people to just walk around the city. It's appalling, really. Sidewalks have been ignored for years and years in Charlottesville, and they a lot of the city is basically laid out like a suburb in the middle of nowhere where there's no need for sidewalks. And in my neighborhood, people are obliged to walk in the street. And this is one thing when you're young and able and willing. There are I have plenty of neighbors who use walkers, and this is really grossly unfair to them. And it's unsafe. And if you increase density, you're going to have more traffic on the roads. You know, inevitably, even if there's less driving, you have a lot more population, you're going to have more driving. And this is going to just create a really unsafe situation. The lack of sidewalks is almost certainly a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. I mean, it's the sort of essential feature. It's something that, you know, you don't have to be able to ride a bike to use. You know, you don't have to, you know, I would feel much more comfortable about my 10-year-old daughter, say, going to visit friends if she's going to walk in the street where there, you know, there's a blind curve where people sometimes turn in way too fast, and it's just really frustrating why this is never seems to be a priority. But it seems like if it's not part of the zoning process, it really should be, because you know, if, I'm down with the goal of increasing density. Truly, I think it's inevitable. It should be done, but people have got to be able to walk. And you know, this is actually the neighborhood I live in is actually one of the more walkable neighborhoods in Charlottesville, sadly enough. So it's true citywide. It doesn't seem to, you know, correspond with, you know, traditionally you know, favored neighborhoods or whatever. Anyway, just wanted to get that off my chest. Thank you. Can that be a part of the zoning process? Can this be part of it? Because I mean, just relying on developers to do this as a proffer or whatever, doesn't that just drive up the cost of housing? You know, I mean, you're trying to like get rid of parking minimums to reduce the cost of housing, but if you're saying, okay, build a sidewalk, and this, besides, this is such a basic function of city government. I don't know why this has been ignored. It's really embarrassing. Anyway, I'll shut up and let you respond. Thanks.
Well,
Yeah,
Chrissy,
it's a great question. Go ahead.
I'm just going to punt it to you, see if you had any thoughts on that, whether zoning can play a role in that at all, or what your thoughts are.
Yeah, it's a great comment, and we absolutely agree that sidewalks and street trees, I'll put those together. You know, those really are essential to thinking about how we move about our cities in a safe way and an equitable way, right? So we want everyone who can't or chooses not to drive to be able to get places safely. So we are currently trying to figure out how much we can incorporate street trees and sidewalks into zoning. Fundamentally, it's a state law question because right now it lives in subdivision, and it seems to be in Virginia. That's mostly what it's associated with. So it's sort of outside the bubble of zoning, but we are thinking about it really hard and trying to figure out what we can do from a zoning perspective. So hopefully I'll have more answers for you in module 2. I do want to recognize that we hear you, we agree with you, but it may be that it just has to live in a subdivision world from a Virginia state law perspective, but we are thinking about it. And I do encourage you to continue to talk about that. It sort of lives in the funding world as well. So we're doing what we can.
We've walked the streets too. I was telling folks when I was in town last week, I walked from my hotel up the English Inn to the downtown mall, and it was a wild walk. So, you know, we've walked the streets too. We surely understand what you're saying, and we've heard a lot about that, as Lyle was saying he has as well. There are no other hands. I'll say that again in case more of them pop up here, which I certainly welcome. But yeah, Tim, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. I know that we'll be keeping a close eye out for module 2 and looking at development standards and everything. But listening tonight, you know, I'm kind of recognizing that we have the sensitive community areas overlay. And I think the reasoning and the intention behind that is awesome. It makes a ton of sense to kind of have extra protection or more sensitivity towards certain neighborhoods, both historically and demographically. Like, we need to be thinking about that in Charlottesville. Those same neighborhoods are the neighborhoods that have the lowest tree canopy coverage. They're not necessarily declining the fastest at the most rapid rate, but that's because there aren't many trees to begin with. And I'm just wondering if one way to kind of get at more of like an equitable distribution of healthy livable neighborhoods would be to almost create like a corollary overlay for the few neighborhoods that have less than a certain threshold of tree canopy coverage. And what the Tree Commission has found is, both Star Hill and 10th and Page and Rose Hill neighborhoods have less than 25% tree coverage, and 2 of those are less than 20%. And that's where you start, academic research shows that's where you start to see an uptick in behavioral issues in youth, clusters of heat-related illnesses that are worse than neighborhoods that have more leafy tree coverage. So I don't know how well studied or if there's precedent for that kind of a thing, but I'm wondering whether it's module 1 and or module 2, if an overlay district could be considered for low canopy neighborhoods, both as an environmental sustainability and resilience issue, and also as an equity issue.
I think it's a great point. And, we are really thinking about the overlay from a zoning entitlement perspective. But what I encourage you all to continue to think about is that overlay currently exists in your comprehensive plan, which is a guiding policy document. And so that means that programs like the organization that was mentioned earlier that has a lot of funding, you should be using that overlay that already exists in that adopted plan and say, this is a priority area where we want to build in those programs for putting in trees, for doing these environmental programs that can help address some of those issues. It's also a great policy document. This is all outside of zoning. Great policy document for priority funding for anti-displacement, all of those things. So that overlay currently exists, and I encourage you to think about ways to use it to achieve a lot of the goals and address a lot of the issues that you're talking about.
Yeah, that's clever, and I think you're right. But I also wonder if at the same time zoning could also help address it, through certain district regulations or development standards or some combination of those things. But yeah, I think those are good thoughts as well.
I just wanted to mention that we tried to get trees and seating on the side streets so that people would have a place to enjoy being downtown, and maybe fix up the crosswalk so that would look better and be safer. And who really decided we could not do that was the fire department. They said zoning does not allow you to do that. I don't know what the fire department has to do with that.
There are always overlapping
Yeah.
issues with any types of development, and fire departments, like they are thinking about the fire code. So I don't know about that particular instance, but anytime we're dealing with a built environment, there are layers of regulation, and fire is certainly one of those layers.
Seemed to be a non-starter to allow trees to be planted and benches, etc.
I'm not sure of sort of the requirements they're looking at. It's not my area of expertise, but Ethan noted, often emergency vehicle access types of issues.
Is that access?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, it sounds nice, but
yeah, important. Diane, go ahead.
Yeah, in listening to this conversation about trees, I think that you're doing this zoning rewrite. It's hopefully it's a once in a city's generation experience, and so that we're not just writing the zoning for today, but for the tomorrows. And that to understand, what a lot of this discussion about vegetation, about trees is requiring that these documents, even though it's not necessarily conventional purview of zoning, to understand that trees, to not think of them as elements, but I think the phrase urban ecology is more significant, that it's a public health issue, and that it's not beautification, it's not objects, but it's an urban ecology that functions. If we use the systems metaphor, that it's the lungs of the city, and And so the arguments of, oh, well, if you knock down trees here, you're saving from knocking them down there. It's a false argument that children and old folks in any part of the city deserve to have breeze and air, and it's a public health issue. It's also an energy issue. There's been plenty of reports in the past year about the temperature at 10th and Page versus Rugby Road. The cost of energy, again, the public health issue as our heat increases and summer nights, and the retention of the ambient heat through the night, and so therefore the energy load that's required, I'm sure that all of you are familiar with these various different things. And so that as you're looking at this upgrade of our approach to land use, that we're looking at the environment as an essential infrastructure, and that we're also looking at resiliency. That as we build, I think that everyone, the affordable housing and affordability is a given, but these are no less an existential issue than the right to have a roof over your head. And so I think that the desire for innovation and creative thinking and far-reaching is really to be pulling these threads forward into a document that will serve the city, not just immediately, but in the coming years. And I think that the impact on the climate, all the unknown knowns need to be or should be incorporated into this document. So it truly is a brilliantly, that the flexibility isn't just about form, but that it's a dynamic, and I taught land use law at UVA. I get the state I get the state limitations, but that can we not be more anticipatory about what this document needs to be, so that it too can handle change that's coming.
I think that's I don't want to cut anybody off, but I think that's a great sort of closing comment that summarizes the goals that we're trying to do with zoning. We know zoning is sort of a little bubble, and we can only do so much with it. So it's whether it's the urban ecology, infrastructure, sidewalks, even housing affordability. Right now we know that your current ordinance creates a lot of barriers to those goals. So our goal with this ordinance really is to give you a solid foundation that balances all of these values. But we also know that zoning is not going to get us all the way there on any of these one things. So we want to reduce those barriers, provide that flexibility, balance these values. But I also just want to encourage you all that as that good foundation is in place, it's going to take additional funding, additional programs, all these things that are outside of zoning to really support all of these goals from the comprehensive plan. So really, we're trying to give you a good foundation, but it's never going to get us all of the way there on any of these issues. So that's just sort of a point of encouragement, and also a bit of an expectation setting. We do want to continue to make sure that we get that foundation right. It's part of what we're doing here. But it takes the programs, it takes the funding on top of it to really support all of these goals and issues.
Well, thanks, Diane, and thanks, Christine, and thanks to everyone for all your really thoughtful comments tonight, and that we heard from you at meetings and by email and whatnot. We'll keep hearing more from you. We don't need to pull up the slides again, but just a reminder, the next steps. So we shared one module of 3. The next module we're expecting to release by the end of, by the 17th at the latest, the week of March 13th. So you can keep an eye out for that. I guess, is that St. Patrick's Day? Could be. So that's what we're planning to release that. That's the development standards, which we've talked a lot about tonight. We know it's of great interest. Module 3 expecting to release the week of April 3rd. So we will be sharing those with you all when they come out. Whatever we send to you, when those come out, you can forward on to whoever you want. We'll have emails that go out to our email list at the same time. But we appreciate you helping to share this with your communities and the people you represent, which you're representing so well with your comments. So that being said, we can wrap up a little early, I believe, but unless Christy, did you have any final thoughts?
Questions or comments?
Just have the steering committee meetings been scheduled for these? Will we have one to review 2 and one to review 3, or what can we anticipate in the coming?
Yes. Sorry, I froze for a second. Hopefully you can all hear me. So we will be scheduling those meetings. We're working to finalize the schedule for public, open house situations. We're going to try to do some other events as well for modules 2 and 3. So we're trying to schedule those along with the steering committee. But yes, we'll be reaching out to you soon to finalize that timing. There'll be one for each of the 2 modules steering committee meeting. So 2 more meetings on the modules. Sorry, is that clear? Hopefully.
Yeah, okay, so there'll be an individual meeting for 2 and then an individual meeting for 3. I guess that's what I'm trying to clarify.
Yeah.
Yes, okay.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that more clearly than I did.
You're tired.
It's been a long day. Yeah.
It's a long day.
Cool. Well, yeah, thanks to all of you. Look forward to continuing to work with you. Have a good rest of your night.
Thank you.
You.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks very much.